Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 10, a podcast about labor, the workplace, unions, union education, and much more. I am Carlos Garrido, your host from Midwestern Marks. Along with me today, we have our guest for the rest of the series, John Henry. He's a railroad worker in the US. And today we wanted to talk about the workplace. But before that, uh, and when we were thinking about what we can talk about for our first episode, the topic of the history of labor came up, the topic of union education came up, and a few other topics came up that are great topics and that we'll touch on in the future. But there was uh, the conclusion was that we should talk about the workplace as the initial unit out of which everything else grows. Um, so, John, why the workplace?
I think that I know the workplace is where the point of exploitation occurs within a capitalist mode of production, and you see people talk all of the time about, oh, this is an element of capitalism or this is an element of capitalism, but rarely do they attempt to define the system in such a way that its core structure and everything that it comes out of it first occurs within the mode of production. And by production, I quite literally mean the place where the commodities in which we utilize for our society, everything from the materials that go into construction or the commodities in which we utilize to handle our daily lives. The point of production is that place in which workers take raw materials and produce those commodities or extract those commodities. And rarely do we see people that are involved politically or have political opinions take seriously the mode of production and take seriously the place of production, and that is the workplace. And it's not as sexy as the political realm is. It's much more dictated and localized in certain ways. There's different work rules in different workplaces, and um, there's so much that goes into production in each locality and each workplace that it would be very difficult for an individual to know and understand everything in every field. And so when people resort to the political realm as their expression, so people would describe themselves as a socialist. Now, in my own view, that's an economic opinion. Um, First and foremost, it means worker ownership of the means of production, but that has political implications. And the political realm is where most people dwell and where most people that are interested in politics, that is where they do the variety of their research and the variety of their conversing. And to call yourself a socialist or to call yourself a Marxist more specifically is to understand that the political realm is only an outgrowth of the economic realm. And the economic realm begins at the point of production in the workplace itself. And that is why it's important to focus specifically on the workplace and how production operates. The very detailed, um, the very detailed analysis of the productive process in the locality, and then recognizing how that flows into a larger realm of production that dominates an entire nation state and then pockets of the globe as well, and to recognize how that works and where the worker stands in connection to that. And that forms the basis of our politics, our culture, our social relations. Everything sprouts from this position within the workplace, and that needs to be the starting point for any conversation regarding in my opinion, for every conversation regarding politics or particularly socialism.
I absolutely agree. What I find absolutely fascinating is that people who call themselves Marxists, who engage with Marxist texts, at least they cite them. I don't know if they engage with them honestly. Uh, they they react in this manner of focusing on the political a lot of the times out of a fear of a boogeyman called economic reductionism. Um, and maybe it's because we're younger, but it seems like the boogeyman of economic reductionism appears all over the place without economic reductionism ever really appearing. Um, so, what's the? You mentioned that there's an aesthetic element to the political that is perhaps not there in the economic realm of analyzing the workplace. You also mentioned that there's something about workplaces that don't allow themselves to be enclosed under one broad uh, uh, conceptualization. Each workplace has different particularities to it and has to be understood in its particular context. The political realm seems like that approach, it seems like it's a more universalizable realm where things can be interpreted more theoretically and generally, and that divorce themselves more from concrete realities. So my concrete question is how why do you think this has been the case? Has there been uh, an intentional um, shift towards the political, um, or has it been uh, what do you is this shift something that reveals a natural mechanism of capitalist development, or is it the infiltration of department agencies in the 60s through the new left and corrupting it? Because it seems like this wasn't usually the case. And 70 years ago, when you proclaimed yourself a Marxist or a socialist in the US, it was pretty clear that it was an economic position, not just a political one. So, what do you see as the source and the engine of um, this infatuation with the political and complete uh, uh, complete oblivion to the economic?
You know, for on my end, it's pure speculation for the most part. But part of it, I think that there's a lot of truth to it. I look at the class element in regards to who's involved with talking about politics and who's driving the conversations about particular politics. So, left-wing politics in the United States. If we take a true and honest look at the class makeup of left-wing politics and who is espousing left-wing politics, very, very few of them are workers. Um, and very few of them have ever been involved or incorporated with workers. Um, and that's one of the main key reasons why I think the realm of politics becomes the realm of struggle for these people, because they aren't necessarily positioned in the economy to make political they're not positioned within the economy to make political demands from an economic perspective. And by that, I mean, this is fairly broad. I'll try to just give like an example. Most historically, petty bourgeois, middle class individuals who were shop owners or who were professionals in particular regions, their positions were sort of sustained by a working class within a locality. So a working class that had been employed and been able to struggle for wages within their workplace that allowed them to shop and to do business in their local area. And the middle class was in part sustained by the working class. And currently, the individuals, I would just say, from my own view, they're individuals that are extremely involved within politics, and that, our generation, Carlos, is very interested in expressing themselves online. And those individuals that post their politics constantly on their Instagram stories or on Twitter, most of them aren't workers. And politics for them is an aesthetic thing. Um, and it not only is that, but that's the only place where their struggle means means anything, because an economic struggle for them looks like them demanding workers doing more for them demanding that workers produce more for them so that they can own things that are equal friendly, or and they just continuously buy commodities that match their political views, and they demand that work be done for them, because they are either incapable or incompetent as to doing that work themselves. But I do think that that wasn't it wasn't a self-inflicted wound. Obviously, the loss of industrial jobs, due to neoliberal politics, has a big deal to play in that. Um, but if I were to give an answer to why the political struggle takes such a you know it takes such a priority to most people that are socialists or Marxists, it's strictly because of their position within the economy. They aren't necessarily workers, and so the economic struggle is not the same for them, and they've never had to struggle necessarily the same way in the economic sense. And so it just becomes the realm where they can, it's where their interest lies. It's um, many individuals involved in media or journalism, their interest is in this stuff because they don't see themselves. That's where the business lies for them, right? Because the news is coming from that area. They can utilize politics continuously for news, and news keeps them in business. And the wackier that news is, the crazier that news is in the political realm, the better they do, because they can continuously write stories and they continuously can publish. And that's why you have just like the absolute insane filth that comes from our media class within the United States. But like I said, that's, from my perspective, it's sort of speculation on why that has occurred. But I think people have been enamored with the political realm, not just in our generation, but I think that this is something that stretches back quite a long ways, because even though left-wing movements and socialist movements were larger in the past within the United States, they still never had a majority of the working class. And the working class never really voted, never really saw themselves as a class and were conscious of themselves as a class. And the separation between what constitutes socialism and the left within the United States and workers, they have been separated. They aren't the same thing. And I think people fail to recognize that constantly, because we have organizations, socialist organizations, who claim to espouse the ideas of the working class and then fight for the working class, when in reality the working class is just in its current realm, isn't a class for itself. It's not a class acting as a class necessarily. In the productive realm, it is. The working class works together constantly. It is continuously producing, and it's working in coordination with itself across the country and across the globe, there is no class cohesion at this point. And that class cohesion changes from area to area based on all sorts of different things, cultures and languages and the way of life that people have. And yeah, I mean, to refocus back on the workplace, we're honest about this podcast in that we aren't going to be speaking directly to workers as such. Most of the individuals that we might reach, being ambitious, are going to be people that are politically engaged, but that are thinking of the ideas of socialism, have been engaging with the ideas of socialism and the ideas of Marxism, and then wanting to maybe develop more of an idea about what to do about those ideas. And we want to change. This is something that socialists in the past have understood. And you and I have talked about it in the past, Carlos, that socialists understood that the move that needs to occur is that the economic base needs to be focused on. And when the economic struggle, which means class struggle, gets to a position where the working class has enough economic power, if they become the most powerful class, the most dominant class in the economic realm, then the political realm is theirs for the taking. And that is how Marx understood preceding societies and preceding modes of production to having developed into newer modes of production, is that a class becomes economically powerful enough to basically seize the realm of the state. And in all honesty, the realm of the state is out of reach at the moment, at the level that we'd like it to. And we kind of have a saying in the labor movement. Well, it's not really even a saying in the labor movement. And to say that the labor movement is one cohesive thing as well is another topic. But that we could have seized political power with Bernie Sanders potentially. There was a potential there. I thought 2016 there was a higher potential than in 2020. But even if we had seized the state with an individual like him, we would have not had the economic struggle built to a point where they could have done anything worth a shit. It takes much more, and that economic arena needs to be fought in more at this point of struggle, at this stage of struggle, than the political realm. And we consistently have to pay attention to the political realm. I'm not saying that we disregard it all completely, but but refocusing and reassessing the base of the economy and the base of the mode of production that we live in. And any serious socialist, any serious Marxist is going to have to come to grips with the fact that the stage of struggle within the economic realm, particularly within the United States, is very low. There isn't much of a struggle in the case of our economic system within the United States. And in our workplaces, there is no struggle. It consistently is right now the owning classes and the ideas of ownership, which means higher productivity, less wages, lowering working conditions for workers. Those ideas and the individuals and the class that holds on to economic power currently and that owns the economy, they are completely running over the workers within the United States and elsewhere. And everybody wants to take their struggle in a political way. And even say the Bessemer vote in Alabama at the Amazon warehouse, a recognition that even winning a union vote is a sort of political struggle at this moment, that there wasn't enough, say, working class organization to make that an effective campaign. And so we have to restart. We have to go back. We have to go back to the beginning and really learn about those things, and then decide where we go from there. Um,
I think it's it is not a coincidence that you have at the turn of the century in the U.S., whether it's anarchist, communist, or socialist, they all share in the sentiment that it is, as um, Bill Hayward said, first a shop fight. Uh,
mhm.
Everyone was clear on that. So I don't think that in that moment where, even though we had, if we still want to use the term left, I don't even know how much we want to hold on to it, but we had a pretty eclectic left, um, but everyone was predominantly, each part of it was predominantly um, composed of workers. And being composed of workers, it realized this truth that it is first a shop fight. So I don't think it's a coincidence, like you said, that the predominant class position of the left changes towards petty bourgeois circles, and then magically the the ideas that it's a political fight first um, come about. Uh, One of the arguments that is given from their side as a defense to their case, and it is the one that spearheaded the last Jacobin magazine issue, was that whether us salty Marxist Leninists would like to admit it or not, the political realm is the realm materially that people are engaging with the most. Um, and whether we want to admit that reality or not, it stays de facto being the case. And therefore, our organization should be where the most eyes are. What would you say to this analysis that poses itself as a material analysis that claims to understand the material conditions of where the focus is and react accordingly to those?
Yeah, I know that there's been quite a few ideas going about in that Jacobin circle of individuals too, that there's a need for like a workers or a labor party at this stage. And my response to that is, you already have socialist parties or workers parties that claim to be. And why aren't workers voting for them? And not only that, but workers, like I said earlier, at this stage aren't even recognizing themselves as workers within their vote. They're not voting because, hey, I'm a worker and this is what a worker should vote for. They're voting for all other specific reasons. And the working class isn't a block group of votes. I mean, I've had the conversation with many different people just regarding the level of union popularity within the United States. And we see some studies saying that 68% of people within the United States support unions. Well, why don't we have 68% of the population in a union then? Why aren't these people demanding that they are represented by a union or talking to their coworkers about it? And when we recognize that within the private sector of the economy, which within the United States is where most production occurs, within the private sector, we don't have a very high level of union organization, union representation. And within that low level, right, less than 7% or whatever the number is of private sector jobs are unionized. Then you look at workplaces particularly, and you ask workers, how many of you support your union or look up to your union as a institution that can better your conditions here at the workplace, or just in popularity contests? How many of you are in favor of your union? How many of you do not like your union? That less than 7% of private sector jobs that are union represented, there's going to be a very low percentage of workers in those jobs that actually support their unions and actually are active and engaged within their unions. To give an example from my own workplace, I'd not heard of, there's 200 people on the property that I work on, about. I've not heard a single person say anything good about our union. And that's a struggle that needs to be waged. Not only does our union have some responsibility in that, but our membership has responsibility in that. And frankly, the political left has responsibility in that as well. And that struggle is not one that is talked about. And it's not a sexy one, because it's something where you have to gain respect of your coworkers, and you have to advocate for things on a level of your workers and your coworkers that puts you in a position and puts each other in a position where you can make material gains from your organization on an immediate level. Most individuals do not want to do that work. Union organizing right now, if you follow the AFL-CIO on social media, or if you follow anyone who covers unions and labor in social media, most of the coverage is in very specific realms of the economy. I mean, there's a lot more news outlets, and there's a lot more white collar jobs that are voting to join unions, rather than what traditionally had been organized into working class organizations, which was your productive jobs, your productive industry, your blue collar jobs, both in factories and also in trades. And most people on the political left today, or that would be in realms that you and I have circulated in, most of them aren't even going to want to discuss those realms of the economy. I mean, those most people do not want to do that. Either they weren't grown up in a position where that's the type of work that they were surrounded by, or they just see themselves as too good. And I think that that's a big issue. But I don't think that workers in the United States really give a shit about what these people have to say, and if they think that they're too good for the work or not, because workers still recognize their place, and most are proud of it. Whether they, like I said, whether they act as a class or anything, people are proud of their position within the economy and proud of the work that they do. And that's something that's very important. And I don't think that many people are taking advantage of at the current stage. But like I said, the struggle, engaging the struggle by economic organization, is extremely important. And once we recognize the importance of that, we begin to understand that the stage of struggle that we're currently at is not favorable. It's very not favorable. And the major capitalists within the United States, they know this. The last thing that they're ever expecting is any sort of worker organization to gain any sort of strength.
I absolutely agree. One of the things that you mentioned was the shift from efforts of unionization from traditionally blue to white collar uh, jobs, usually service jobs and work in that realm. Um, Along with the trend of movement towards the political sphere, there also seems to be a trend of redefining what the concept of working class is. Uh, there has been a really, really broad definition of working class that includes anyone that receives a wage. And I think we could both agree that this is not a Marxist definition. Marx,
It certainly isn't a scientific definition.
it's yeah, absolutely. There's two central components to defining a class in Marx. The first one is a group's relationship to production, a group's relation to production. The second one is the group's mode of life and culture. Um, None of these two conditions are being used to distinguish between classes. Um, so, does that play any importance in seeing where the pressure points in the economy are? Um, how does that set us back in even conceiving of what workplace it is that plays a more central role in the functionings of capital?
Yeah. This broad definition of the working class is something that has sort of come about. You can pinpoint it in our in our political realm right now, and it was Bernie who came out with the 99% and the 1%. And when that was the defining element within society, and I I was never involved in the planning of the marketing of that approach. Um, However, I can understand what they were attempting to do. And it was attempting to create basically a vast majority of the populace who saw themselves in the same place, um, in regards to power within the United States. But the effect of it, the long term effect, was that people that became politically engaged through the Bernie campaign began to see class as something defined by your income. And to some extent, that is one way of gauging a position within society. Now, what Marxists understand as class, that's not the case. We recognize the role and the position to the means of production as the as how classes become divided in the first place, within a capitalist economy. But then also we see more classes arise, and a scientific approach needs to be taken to those. We need to recognize the difference between, say, someone who works in a heavy industry, at least the role that they play within the economy, right? Like, this isn't a moralistic claim against anyone. I'm not saying that anyone's job is, you know, I'm not saying that there's no dignity in certain work. What I'm saying is, from an economic perspective, there is a difference between someone who works within heavy industry and someone who works as, I mean, you name it. Most of the jobs that kids went to college to get, most of those jobs are not positions within the economy that have any sway. They've been areas that have been sort of zoned out by surplus capital, and they've been able to like exist, but not have any economic power. And I don't want anyone to take this as like their jobs or their careers are worthless. It doesn't mean that. It's just taking an approach to defining class and recognizing that there are specific industries that require and that have a position in the economy that is much more important than others. It's one thing if the grad students at NYU go on strike. It's another thing when 1,100 coal miners do in Alabama. And the coal that is produced from that specific pit, or those multiple pits just under the same company, the coal that's produced there or that's extracted there goes to power either power plants within those local areas, goes to power factories in the production of their own commodities. The world isn't going to shut down. NYU might, but the world isn't going to shut down if NYU grad students go on strike. And like I said, I'm not saying that it's not a good thing for them to be doing that, because if their demands are met by what they're doing, that's good for them. But a complete neglect has happened for what I consider the working class, which are those that work within productive industry. And to include all of these different classes into the definition of working class has been very, very harmful to the idea of class as such. Adam Przeworski, in his book Capitalism and Social Democracy, which was very, I wouldn't say influential, but very illuminating for me, is that a recognition that there's sort of a dilemma that is taking place within the political sphere, not within the economic sphere, but within the political sphere, of working class socialist or labor parties having to decide, because particularly within a country like the United States, that the working class is not the majority of the population. Those that work within productive industry are not the majority. And because we live with a political system in which we need a majority in order to gain political supremacy, these political parties that have considered themselves to represent the working class they've had to make alliances, and they've had to make statements with respect to other classes to try and bring those classes into the voting block of their own. But as soon as they did that, the definition of class, when they broadened it, it made the idea of class less of an identifier amongst actual workers, because now you have these individuals that work entirely different jobs and have entirely different positions within the economy. Nothing about their life is the same. Nothing about going to work for them is the same. And now you have them in the same party, and you're telling them that they have to vote for the same things, even though their ideas regarding the workplace are completely different than each other's. And the other political doom that these parties have gotten into on the other horn of the dilemma is that they stick to class too strongly. And when they do that, they doom themselves to political failure. But what they fail to recognize is the economic power, or what Przeworski fails to recognize, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but what he fails to recognize is the economic power that class, that minority class within society, holds. And that economic power can gain political concessions basically whenever they want to, and act as a class in that way. But yeah, that's a dilemma that we are situated within. The left is working towards a very broad definition of the working class, and I think that it completely gets rid of the idea of the working class as such.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. One of the first things I wanted to touch on is you mentioned the that bringing in the discourse of analyzing the influence different types of jobs have in the economy, different positions within the working mass, right, have within the economy, that usually the reaction from people who are not in those spaces that have are at the pressure points of capitalism has been one that kind of takes us to offense. Um, I remember you and I were both um, at a, at a at a meeting in Iowa, um, and there was this event where we brought this up, and a service industry person said, "No, but all work is dignified." And what you could see in that reaction of taking into offense is how they're defining class. They're defining class in a normative sense, not in a scientific sense. Um, and I think that, like you said, there was a certain there was something valid in the 99% slogan, right? Um, because you do need a normative element. The normative element is what pushes people. But like one of the first great Marxists in the US stated, Daniel de Leon, he provides an analogy of a ship, and the actual wooden part of the ship is the scientific analysis, the sails are the normative part. It seems like the ship has collapsed and all we have is sails. We need to build up that scientific analysis, and that means not being so loose with how we think of the working class. Now, like you said, a in reference to the capitalism and social democracy text, um, there is a contradiction here, which is that the class that wields the most power, because of their position in the economy, in the way that industrial capitalism has developed and globalized, is not a minority, is not a majority class, right? So in this way, the thesis, the famous thesis from the manifesto of polarization, did not plan out. Um, so there is going to need there is it is a necessity for the working class, specifically the one that we're referring to as the working class, to build coalitions in order to grab power. Um, but the problem is how do we make sure those coalitions are not corrupted by interests that are not directly of and from the working class? Um, so eh, what would be a good, like, how do you approach that? I don't think it's been something that has been necessarily done before. I know in the Latin American countries where a working class party has been able to achieve power, it has been through coalition building, but it we don't have the same material conditions. So, um, how do you envision a project like that?
I don't right now. I mean, if I'm being completely honest, I don't. And I don't think we need to.
Mhm.
The working class isn't even operating as a class for itself with that idea in mind of being a class.
Mhm.
So why would we put the cart before the horse and say, "Oh, we need to start building coalitions," when our working class isn't even a class in any identifiable sense of the word?
Mhm.
And that's the why the focus on the workplace is so necessary, because so many people want to talk about these things, like we need to build a coalition with indigenous groups, or we need to build a coalition with these groups or that group, or this identity group or this identity group. Our class, or I shouldn't say our class, because the left doesn't share a class themselves. They do not constitute a class. The political left is run by a class of individuals that is not the working class. And as soon as people start to recognize that, the sooner they will understand that the working class within this country much less identifies themselves politically. They and not even, like I said, as a class. Like in my mind, this is a basic concept, but I feel that many other people don't either see it or understand it. And that is, how could we even begin to talk about having a working class political party, right? Like many Jacobin writers and editors have been talking about for 4 or 5 years. How can we even begin to talk about that stuff when private sector unionism is below 7%, and support for those unions within those workplaces are even lower than that? It blows my mind at how unscientific so-called scientific leftists or scientific socialists have been. It absolutely blows my mind. And that's why this project is very important. It's to get those people, those that consider themselves scientific socialists, to start doing science and not only doing science, but if you're serious about organizing in these arenas, or if these are the defining terms of your politics, if socialism is the defining term of your politics, or Marxism is the defining term of your politics, then you cannot and should not overlook the role of economic organization, and understand when political positions harm that economic organization, and understand which political positions, or how the working class, or those within the working class, within your locality, your region, your area, how does the class view politics as such, and or the political positions that you hold. Of course, there has to be convincing of, like, why you should support this or why you should support that. But the last serious attempt to form a labor party within the United States in the 1990s was sort of spearheaded by this man, Tony Mazzocchi. And one of his, he had this basically like a union hall slogan: if you couldn't pass it in your local hall, don't bring it to the larger organization. And that's something that we don't do anymore. People read something online and they think that that's the best idea that they've ever thought of, and that's their idea, and they don't agree. They won't talk to anybody that doesn't have that idea. But your local area, if you can't get your coworkers on board with this idea, then don't make it the defining position that you are gonna. Don't make it the thing that you're gonna die on a hill for.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is an element of political struggle that goes into that. But if I could continuously emphasize, like, geez, the economic struggle is where it's at, and it's where everything's going to bring any fruitful gains that are going to be made happen to the economic struggle. Like, we do live in a place where there's a great and vibrant history of economic struggle. The United States has awesome history of economic struggle. And it's being written to this day by individuals and by workers in workplaces. And that's the stuff that's not being talked about, that economic struggle, and on a localized level, particularly.
Absolutely. So, to conclude, one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning was our honesty of who's listening. Um, so what? I think that a lot of the things that we said here might come to shock quite a few people. Um, what what to do with this information if you are a an undergraduate socialist in a campus socialist club, and you want to do whatever you can to advance the class struggle in the U.S. What are you waking up tomorrow determined to start doing?
Advocate for the reindustrialization of the country. No, I mean, I'm not going to tell people to go out and, if you are serious about it, and yeah, I'm not going to tell anyone to do anything, really. Um, Other than like think about these things. I'm not going to tell people like, oh, you got to go and upend your entire life or all the plans that you've currently made. But I'd rather people be realistic about their position within the economy. And I want people to be realistic about their buddies and the people that they surround themselves with. Um, yeah, just the idea of don't necessarily define class by income, you know? Start to look into things from a scientific perspective and the relations of the means of production. Now, if that leads you to a position where you feel obligated to either organize within a particular sector within the economy or just take a job in those places within the economy, okay, that's good for you. We need more people that are dedicated and disciplined enough to organize within these areas. Um, but I'm not going to tell anyone that they need to do anything like that. I mean, in my own mind, I think that's quite cultish. And but I think being realistic is the major takeaway. It's be realistic, but be scientific, and to yeah, it's like I think the last thing that I ever would want would be a bunch of young socialists into a a bunch of industrial workplaces. Like, I think that would be extremely harmful to the idea, to the things that we'd like into working class organization. Um, but look at Marx and Engels, for example. They were two individuals that scientifically analyzed class and scientifically analyzed the mode of production under capitalism, and neither of them were obligated to go and work in one of Engels's family mills. They didn't do that, but that didn't mean they weren't antagonistic to the working class. They wanted to scientifically understand how the working class operated within their areas and in other parts of the globe. But it all came down to recognizing the production for them. You know, their their analysis of class had to do much more with the with the mode of production, with the point of production within the workplace than it did with the songs that the working class were singing. It was a scientific position, and that's what needs to happen to this day. And what I can, you know, I work within an industry that's very vital within the economy. So much so that there's federal legislation barring us from taking industrial action without arbitration and congressional oversight. And I don't see leftists advocating for the repealing of those laws or the amending to those laws that dictate our operations on a daily level. And so who are they trying to make friends with? It doesn't seem like they're trying to make friends with the working class. And or like I said, I can't even say the word working class because the working class doesn't operate as a class right now. Like, and that's yeah, that's a key element that we need to start to recognize.
That's it's one of the things that Eddie and I have emphasized in previous podcasts, that um, we do agree with the vanguardist strategy, um, but it'd be a mess if the current left starts stepping into workplace. So there needs to be a change, that process of marination that I think is what you're referring to. That needs to take place first before anyone can think of going where the masses are, as Lenin would say. Um, so I don't want to put the theory hat on such a nice practical episode, but the Althusser makes this distinction on between instinct and revolution, where some of these things in relation to the class struggle and understanding materialism from a proletarian standpoint, it's just an instinct for workers. For those outside of the working class, they need to go through a personal revolution. Like they need to completely transform the way they see life from their position in their class position in the economy, in order to then be able to be contributive in a healthy way to the class struggle. And that's not an easy task. It isn't, right? But I think it's a task that has to take place before any actual concrete going to where the masses are can take place in a fruitful manner. Um, so yeah, anything you want to say before we close it off?
Yeah, I think that the last thing that I'll leave it with is, you know, one of my heroes is James Connolly, and he was the one who sort of said it best. Like, the political power for the working class must come out of the industrial battlefield as the expression of the organized economic force of labor, or else it won't come at all. I paraphrase because I couldn't remember the quote directly, but political power has to come from economic organization of the working class. Without that, political power will not come. And so, to re-emphasize that point, it's just working class organization needs to be the priority. And if we scientifically look at working class organization at this stage of development, we see how far behind we are.
Mm.
And when we do that, we see how far away political power on behalf of the working class is. And with that said, I don't see it as a doomsday revelation. I do see it as an opportunity for individuals, and an opportunity for a class to be rebuilt. Um, Demand that we reindustrialize in the United States. Make sure that we have places to work that are localized, and that um, the point the the point of production is within our communities. There are still towns across the country that are still industrial based. We have not completely sold over to the service industry. And to make that point even further, there is a reason why the major banks run hedge funds that own stock in most major industry and own majority shares in most major industry. My industry in particular, the railroad, the major banks within the United States operate hedge funds, manage hedge funds that own the majority shares within the railroads. That capital is utilized for all other functions. It is a steady flow of capital for them coming from a heavy industry. That capital forms the basis of their other investments, of their other operations. That forms the basis of all of that stuff. And so we haven't completely been taken over by a service economy where people do work, I would say, like, in some ways non-essential jobs. Like, I'm not making a normative statement there. I'm saying, like, jobs that that aren't really necessary within an economy. And it seems to me, and the last idea is that I leave off with is that we've forgotten about the industrial arena, and we've acted as if we've lost industry completely, and we haven't. It's still here, and it's going to be here, and it might not look the same as it did 100 years ago, but it still operates, and it still forms a key role within the broader economy, not only our national economy, but the global economy.
Fantastic. Thank you. If you made it this long in the chat, I hope you enjoyed it, and we're hoping to get at least 2 of these a month. So I hope you enjoyed our first podcast episode of Chapter 10. I hope one of you geniuses out there can figure out why it's called Chapter 10 at some point. But yeah, everyone take care.